This is for every daughter who was laughed at for dreaming too big. 10 years ago, I sat in a lawyer's office and watched my entire family laugh. Actually laugh out loud, when I said I was going to build something bigger than all of them combined. My uncle called it cute. My mother told the lawyer not to bother taking me seriously. Last month, I closed on the final property on Maple Ridge Lane, the same street where every single one of them still lives. What none of them know yet is that the mysterious new landlord who just bought the entire block, the one their property manager keeps mentioning, has been me since the very first house sold 8 months ago. If this sounds like your family, hit like right now because what happens next will leave you speechless. My name is Vanessa Hale, and this is the story of how being laughed out of a lawyer's office for dreaming too big ended with me owning the ground my entire family stands on. Have you ever had the people who raised you decide out loud in front of a stranger that your dreams weren't worth taking seriously? For 10 years I told myself that laugh in the lawyer's office didn't matter. That it was just noise, just my family being my family, nothing worth carrying around for a decade. But I kept the folder from that meeting anyway. The one with my original business proposal inside. The one my uncle called a fantasy before he'd even finished reading the first page. I kept it because some part of me knew even then that I'd need to remember exactly how that room sounded the day they decided I wasn't worth believing in. What none of them knew that afternoon was that the lawyer sitting across from us, a quiet, unassuming man named Walter Higgins, would end up being the exact person who, 10 years later, filed the paperwork transferring the deed to their own street into my name. If you've ever had family laugh at a dream you were dead serious about, hit that like button right now. Because what happens on Maple Ridge Lane is about to make every single one of them wish they'd read that proposal a little more carefully. I grew up on Maple Ridge Lane, a quiet street on the edge of Raleigh, North Carolina, in a family that measured success in exactly one currency: predictability. My uncle Frank owned a successful insurance agency. My mother, Diane Hale, worked as a school administrator for 30 years. My cousin Brian became a dentist. My cousin Melissa became an accountant. Every single person in my family had followed a version of the same script. Stable degree, stable job, stable house, ideally on Maple Ridge Lane itself, where 3 separate branches of the family had ended up living within walking distance of each other. I never wanted that script. From the time I was 17, I was obsessed with real estate. Not buying a house someday, but the actual mechanics of it. Property values, zoning, investment cycles. I read foreclosure listings the way other teenagers read magazines. My family found this endlessly amusing. Vanessa's going to be a real estate mogul, my Uncle Frank used to say at holidays, in the exact tone you'd use to describe a child's imaginary friend. At 19, I told my mother I was skipping a traditional 4-year degree to get my real estate license and start investing instead. He didn't yell. She just laughed, a short, disbelieving sound, and said, "With what money, Vanessa? You barely have a savings account." She wasn't wrong about the money. She was wrong about everything else. I worked 2 jobs through my early 20s. A leasing office by day, waiting tables at night, saving every spare dollar toward a down payment on a single small rental property. It took me 3 years to save $22,000. When I finally told my family I'd found a property I wanted to buy, a rundown duplex 2 towns over, my cousin Brian actually laughed out loud at Thanksgiving dinner. "A duplex," he said. "Groundbreaking." I bought it anyway. It wasn't much, $94,000, financed with a hard-earned down payment and a loan I nearly didn't qualify for. I fixed it up myself on weekends, learning plumbing and drywall from YouTube videos because I couldn't afford contractors. Within a year it was fully rented, cash flowing $410 a month after expenses. I told my family about it at Christmas. My Uncle Frank's response was to ask in front of everyone whether I was still doing that little landlord thing, in a tone that made landlord sound like a punchline. By 25 I owned 3 properties. Small ones, unglamorous ones, nothing that impressed anyone at Maple Ridge Lane. I kept reinvesting every dollar of profit instead of spending it, kept living cheaply, kept absorbing the same jokes at every holiday gathering year after year about my little hobby. The lawyer's office wasn't my idea. It was my mother's. A meeting she insisted on, the week I turned 26, that would end up defining the next 10 years of my life. The meeting was billed as a family financial planning session. My grandfather, Harold Hale, had passed the year before and left behind a modest trust, split among his children and grandchildren, and my mother wanted everyone gathered to discuss how the money would be distributed and invested. The office belonged to Walter Higgins, a soft-spoken estate attorney with a small practice near downtown Raleigh. I remember the room clearly, dark wood paneling, a conference table too big for the 8 of us crowded around it, my Uncle Frank at the head like he'd appointed himself chairman. My share of the trust came out to $31,000. Modest by my family's standards. But it was the most money I'd ever had access to at once, and I'd already decided exactly what I wanted to do with it. I want to put my share toward a 4th property, I said when Walter asked if anyone had questions about their distribution. I've got 3 rentals already, all cash flowing. This would let me scale faster. Maybe look at a small multi-unit building instead of another single property. Silence for a second. Then my Uncle Frank laughed. Not a small chuckle. A real, genuine laugh, the kind that made Walter glance up from his paperwork. A multi-unit building, Frank repeated like the words themselves were funny. Vanessa, sweetheart, you're 26 years old with 3 rundown duplexes. You're not exactly Donald Trump. A few people laughed with him. My cousin Brian mostly. My mother didn't laugh, but she didn't stop it either. She just sighed, the sigh she always used when she wanted people to know she agreed but wouldn't say it out loud. I want to build a real portfolio, I said, quieter now, aware the room had shifted against me. This industry has plenty of people who started exactly where I am. This isn't an industry, honey, my Aunt Carol said. It's a hobby that happens to make a little rent money. I've made more from my properties in the last 2 years than most of you made investing your trust distributions in mutual funds, I said, my voice tightening. That's not the same thing, Frank said, and you know it. Real investing means diversification. Stability. Not betting your whole future on some fantasy about owning half of Raleigh. I never said half of Raleigh. You might as well have, he said, and the table laughed again. That easy, comfortable laugh of people who'd been laughing at the same joke for years and had long since stopped noticing it hurt anyone. My mother finally spoke. Vanessa, I think it might be wiser to put your share somewhere more conservative. A retirement account. Something safe. This real estate thing has been fun, but it's time to think about your actual future. I looked around the table at Frank still smiling, at Brian smirking into his coffee, at my mother using the word hobby like she'd used it 100 times before because she had. You laughed at me for buying my first duplex, I said. You laughed when it cash flowed. You're laughing right now in a lawyer's office about a plan that's already made more money than half the accounts sitting at this table. Don't be so sensitive, Frank said. We're just being realistic. Somebody in this family has to be. I looked at Walter, who'd gone quiet, clearly uncomfortable, still holding my $31,000 distribution paperwork in his hands. I'll take the check, I said. And I'd like it processed today if that's all right. Where's it going? My mother asked. Somewhere none of you are going to laugh at again, I said, standing up. Give it 10 years. Frank was still chuckling as I walked out of that office, shaking his head, saying something to Brian I didn't stay long enough to hear. What none of them understood, what I barely understood myself in that moment, was that I'd just made a promise in front of every person who'd ever doubted me, and I intended to spend the next decade making sure I kept it. I put the full $31,000 into a down payment on a 6-unit apartment building on the outskirts of Durham, my first real leap beyond small residential rentals. It was rough, mismanaged, half-vacant when I bought it for $340,000, financed through a combination of savings, a small business loan, and a private investor I'd met through a local real estate meetup group. I didn't tell my family. Not the purchase, not the renovation, not any of it. I'd learned after that lawyer's office that good news delivered to that table only ever came back reframed as luck or recklessness. So I stopped delivering it. The first year was brutal. I managed the building myself, showing units, chasing late rent, learning contractor negotiations the hard way after getting overcharged twice. I worked my leasing office job during the day and handled property management calls on my lunch breaks and evenings. By the end of year one, the building was fully occupied, cash flowing $3,200 a month. I reinvested every dollar. By year three, I'd used the equity from that building to acquire 2 more small multifamily properties, one in Durham and one in Cary. My portfolio crossed $1.1 million in total property value. I quit the leasing office job that year and started working real estate full-time. Not flashy, not glamorous, just steady, methodical acquisition, exactly the kind of unrealistic fantasy my Uncle Frank had laughed at in that conference room. By year 5, I'd formed my own holding company, Ridgeline Property Group, and brought on my first employee, a property manager named Carlos Vega, who handled day-to-day operations across what had grown into 11 properties. Portfolio value crossed $4.7 million. I bought a modest condo of my own that year. My first at 31, paid for entirely in cash. I still went to family gatherings occasionally, mostly for my grandmother Ruth, the one person who'd never laughed at me, not once. She'd ask quiet questions about the business, genuinely curious, and I'd give her honest answers while the rest of the table talked about Brian's dental practice or Melissa's promotion. Frank still called it the landlord thing every time it came up, though the jokes had gotten thinner over the years, less confident, like even he wasn't sure anymore. By year 7, Ridgeline Property Group crossed $9 million in property value, expanding into commercial acquisitions, small retail strips, a self-storage facility outside Raleigh. I'd built a 6-person team. I met David Ferris that year, a commercial contractor I hired for a renovation project who became 18 months later my husband. We married quietly, 30 guests, most of them people from Ridgeline, not Maple Ridge Lane. By year 9, something started nagging at me every time I drove past my childhood street. The neighborhood had changed. A few of the original owners had died or moved into assisted living. I noticed 2 for sale signs go up within months of each other. Homes that had been in the same families for decades, now quietly listed as the older generation aged out and the younger one, my cousins included, showed little interest in staying. I mentioned it to Carlos almost as a joke one afternoon in the office. I grew up on that street, I said, looking at a listing for a house 3 doors down from my mother's. Half my family still lives there. Carlos looked up from his screen. You want to buy it? I sat with that question longer than I expected to. Let's look into it, I finally said. Quietly. Through the LLC. Nobody needs to know whose name is actually behind it. I structured every purchase on Maple Ridge Lane through Ridgeline's acquisitions arm, using a subsidiary entity, Sable Creek Holdings LC, a name with no connection to me, Ridgeline, or anyone on that street. Carlos handled the outward-facing negotiations for every deal, meeting sellers, signing paperwork, presenting himself simply as representing the buyer. The first property came easy, a house 4 doors from my mother's, owned by an elderly widow, Mrs. Patterson, who'd known me since I was a child and had no idea the investment company buying her home belonged to the little girl who used to sell lemonade on her porch. I paid $268,000, slightly above market, because I wanted her to leave comfortable, not because Sable Creek needed to compete for it. Over the following 8 months, 3 more properties came up, 2 through natural sales as aging owners moved to assisted living, 1 through a foreclosure I quietly intervened in before it hit public auction, buying the debt directly and working out generous terms with the family instead of pushing them out. By month 6, Sable Creek Holdings owned 5 of the 11 houses on Maple Ridge Lane. That's when my mother started noticing changes. There's a new landlord buying up the street, she told me on the phone sometime in month 7. One of our now rare conversations, mostly logistics, holidays, nothing personal. Some company called Sable Creek. Bought the Pattersons' old place and the Whitfield house too. Nobody knows who's actually behind it. Huh, I said, keeping my voice carefully flat. That's strange. Frank's furious, she continued. Property taxes have gone up twice since they started buying. Some rumor going around that they're planning to redevelop, maybe put in townhomes. Frank's talking about starting a petition. I nearly laughed out loud. My Uncle Frank, who'd spent a decade mocking me for owning rundown duplexes, was now furious about a mysterious real estate company quietly buying up the very street he lived on, completely unaware the company was mine. By month 8, Sable Creek had acquired the final available property, an empty lot at the end of the lane that had sat vacant for years. That gave me control of 6 of the 11 properties outright, with informal management arrangements or long-standing goodwill covering 2 more, including a rental agreement with the tenant now living in the Patterson house. The HOA called an emergency meeting that month. Maple Ridge Lane technically had a small informal homeowners association, mostly used for street maintenance and an annual block party, but Frank had apparently rallied enough concern to formalize a meeting specifically about the Sable Creek situation. Carlos attended as Sable Creek's representative per usual. This time I told him I wanted to come too. As what? He asked. As Vanessa, I said. Not as anyone's boss. Just as family showing up for a meeting about my own street. The meeting was held in my mother's living room. The same house I'd grown up in, packed with folding chairs, most of the same faces from that lawyer's office 10 years earlier, now considerably older, considerably more anxious. Frank stood at the front, holding a printed spreadsheet of property tax increases. This company has bought 6 houses in 8 months, he announced. 6. Nobody can get a straight answer about their plans. I've called their office 4 times. Some guy named Carlos always answers, never gives a real name behind the LLC. Carlos, sitting near the back next to me, gave a small, apologetic shrug. We need to know who we're actually dealing with, Frank continued, before this company decides to bulldoze half. Maybe, I said from the back of the room, you should just ask them directly. Frank looked up, surprised to see me there at all. I hadn't been to a family gathering in over a year. Vanessa, didn't expect you to make it to this one. I wouldn't have missed it, I said, standing up. Considering I'm the one you've been trying to reach for 8 months. The room went completely silent, the exact silence I remembered from that conference table a decade earlier, except this time every face in it was turned toward me. I'm sorry, my mother said slowly. What did you just say? The street for townhomes. I reached into my bag and pulled out a folder. Sable Creek's ownership documentation, 6 deeds, all filed under the LLC, all ultimately tracing back to Ridgeline Property Group, all ultimately tracing back to me. Sable Creek Holdings, I said, setting the folder down on the coffee table in the middle of the room. That's my company. I bought this street. Nobody said anything for a long moment. Frank stared at the folder like it might rearrange itself into something less true if he looked at it long enough. That's not possible, he finally said. You run some kind of rental thing. A few duplexes. I run Ridgeline Property Group, I said. $9 million in assets 7 years ago. Considerably more now. Sable Creek is one of our acquisition subsidiaries. I've owned 6 houses on this street for the better part of 8 months, including the Patterson house and the empty lot at the end of the lane. You've been buying up the street in secret, my mother said, her voice caught somewhere between disbelief and something that sounded almost like fear. Why would you do that without telling us? Because the last time I told this family what I was building, I said, I was sitting in a lawyer's office and every person in this room laughed at me. Uncle Frank told me I wasn't exactly Donald Trump. You told me to put my money somewhere safe instead. I said, give it 10 years. It's been 10 years. Nobody laughed this time. So what happens now? Frank asked, his voice smaller than I'd ever heard it. Are you raising our rent? Kicking people out? Building townhomes? No, I said. I'm not interested in punishing anyone. I bought this street because it came up for sale quietly, one house at a time, and because some part of me wanted to be the one deciding what happened to it instead of some stranger who never grew up here. Property taxes went up because the whole area's been reassessed, not because of anything I did. I'm not redeveloping anything. I never was. Then why all the secrecy? My mother asked. Because I wanted to see how this family would talk about me when they didn't know it was me, I said, and I let that sentence sit in the room for a moment. And I think we all just found out. Frank had the decency to look uncomfortable. My cousin Brian, sitting near the window, said nothing at all. I turned to my mother specifically. You spent 10 years telling me real estate was a hobby. A phase. Something to grow out of before I got serious about my actual future. I'm not telling you this to rub it in your face. I'm telling you because I need you to understand that the thing you all laughed at in that lawyer's office is the exact thing that now owns more than half of this street, including technically the ground under the house you're currently sitting in. My grandmother Ruth, quiet until now, spoke up from her chair near the fireplace. I always knew, she said simply. I just wish the rest of you had asked her a single real question before you decided to laugh instead. I let the silence hold a little longer before I said what I'd actually come to say. I'm not going to change anything about how this street operates, I said. Rent stays the same. No redevelopment. Mrs. Patterson's old house has a tenant I like, and I intend to keep it that way. I don't need anyone's apology today. I just needed you to know exactly who's been standing quietly outside these rooms for the last 10 years listening, while you decided I wasn't worth taking seriously. I picked my folder back up, said goodnight to my grandmother, and walked out of that living room the same way I'd walked out of the lawyer's office 10 years earlier. Except this time nobody was laughing behind me. It's been 6 months since that meeting in my mother's living room. Maple Ridge Lane hasn't changed much on the surface. Same houses, same street, same block party every summer. But something underneath it has shifted permanently, in ways that have nothing to do with property deeds. My mother calls more often now, careful, sometimes a little unsure of herself in a way I never heard from her before that meeting. Frank hasn't apologized outright, but he stopped calling it the landlord thing entirely, and last month he asked me genuinely what I thought about a commercial property he was considering investing in. It wasn't much. It was something. My grandmother Ruth still lives 2 doors down, in the house I'll never touch, in the neighborhood I quietly decided to protect instead of profit from. She tells people now, whenever it comes up, that her granddaughter owns half the street. With a pride in her voice I waited a very long time to hear from anyone in that family. Here's what 10 years taught me. The people who laugh at your plans aren't always wrong because they're cruel. Sometimes they're wrong because they've never had to imagine a version of the future that didn't already exist in front of them. You don't owe anyone a play-by-play of what you're building while you're still building it. Sometimes the most powerful response to being laughed out of a room is simply becoming undeniable quietly on your own timeline, and letting the truth introduce itself when it's finally ready. I didn't buy that street for revenge. I bought it because I finally could, and because some part of me needed to stand in that lawyer's office one more time, even 10 years later, even in a different room entirely, and prove that, give it 10 years, wasn't just something I said to survive that meeting. It was a promise. If you've ever been laughed at for a dream everyone around you is too comfortable to understand, comment the word undeniable right now. Somewhere in this comment section someone is building their own Maple Ridge Lane quietly on their own time, and they need to know it's working. I'll see you in the next one.